Welcome, everybody, and welcome to our Zoom participants. We are here for the session entitled Hidden Water Creatures, and Emily Heald is our presenter today. Emily works with the Water Action Volunteers program to coordinate volunteer nutrient monitoring and continuous temperature monitoring. She also works to coordinate volunteer aquatic invasive species monitoring on Wisconsin's moving waters via Project Riverine Early Detectors, known as Project RED, and the annual Aquatic Invasive Species Snapshot Day. And many of us remember her from the Discovery Center and have fond memories of her. Here's Emily.
Thanks, Sandy. So like Sandy said, my name's Emily Heald. I am the Rivers Educator for UW-Madison Division of Extension, and I mostly work with aquatic invasive species in my position now, but I really like small things. And so I like to learn about them. I'm not a master of any of them, I would say, but I know a little bit about a lot of different things. And so we're going to go over a lot of different really tiny things that live in lakes. And I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you get as excited about small things as I do. So to start off with, when we first think about lakes and rivers and water systems in general, we tend to think of a picture like this, where you have, the big fish eating the little fish eating the smaller fish. Maybe you have a bird eating a fish or a bird swooping overhead eating a snake or something like that. But very rarely do we think about this bottom layer of the food web here. So all these really small things that actually play a really important role in what's going on in the water. In fact, if you zoom down into that layer, it looks a little bit more something like this, where we have a greater emphasis on those smaller organisms here. And all of these arrows represent an interaction. So you can really just start to see, even with pictures like this, how important those little creatures are to the health of the water. So I'm going to start really small with plankton, and then we'll kind of work our way up. And again, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a lot of different small things. So starting with plankton, I think plankton first became really popular with the cartoon SpongeBob SquarePants. Has anyone seen this before? So that's plankton. He's unfortunately a villain in this cartoon, but I dream of a world where plankton are the good guys. And so hoping to see a cartoon like that in the future. So a little bit of background on the word plankton. That actually comes from the Greek word plankos, which means wandering or drifting, meaning they go where the water takes them. So they can control their movements a little bit. If you saw the zooplankton conversation that happened earlier this morning, they talked a little bit about how zooplankton and plankton can control their movements. But for the most part, they're so small that they kind of go where the water takes them. And there are two types of plankton. We have phytoplankton, which we're going to also call algae today. And the first part of that word phyto comes from the word photosynthetic. So just like flowers and trees and things like that, plants, algae are photosynthetic, meaning they make energy, use energy from the sun to make usable energy. And there's a little quick advance of what phytoplankton can look like. Then we also have zooplankton. I know it looks like zoo, but it's actually zooplankton, with that first part of the word zoo meaning animal, meaning these guys cannot make their own food, meaning they have to eat other organisms. Usually it's the algae, but we'll talk about zooplankton that eat other zooplankton as well. And there's a little sneak peek on those cuties. So starting off with phytoplankton, or algae as we're going to call them, we're going to talk about their diet a little bit. So as I spoke to on the slide before this, algae are photosynthetic, meaning they use energy from the sun to create energy for themselves. That's what they survive off of. And that's really important to everything that goes on in the water system, and on life on Earth, because all of the energy for living organisms originally comes from the sun, right? But you and I cannot directly harvest that energy and live only off sunlight. You can't go sit in the sun and have that beat down on you and come inside feeling full or satiated, right? We need to eat other organisms that do that for us. And that's why algae are so important, because they're converting that energy from the sun into usable energy. So that's the process of photosynthesis. And what happens in photosynthesis, if you're not too familiar, this is an image of a plant above ground, but algae do the same thing here. is light energy will hit a plant or an algae cell, and it also takes in carbon dioxide. And the plant will undergo a series of scientific processes that we won't go into today. And it will create a sugar, and that's what you can eat from those plants or algae and gain energy from. But another byproduct of photosynthesis is also oxygen. And actually, across the world, phytoplankton generate about half the oxygen in the atmosphere. So I want to do a little group activity here. So everyone just kind of sit and notice your breath, or maybe take a deep breath in. And just be thankful for algae. So in this way, algae are kind of the backbone of everything that's happening in the water. They're lifting everything up. They're supporting all of the life in the lakes and rivers. I like to think of them as the Arnold Schwarzenegger of lakes. And when we're thinking about where algae live in lakes and rivers and other water systems, well, they rely on sunlight to get their food, right? So they're usually going to be found pretty close to the sun or somewhere that they can capture that sun energy. In fact, some algae have specialized cells. You can see here, well, maybe you can't see that, but there's some elongated cells in some types of algae that actually help them float closer to the surface of the water so that they have an advantage over other algae, and they're more easily able to capture that sunlight energy. Other places algae like to live, I'm sure you've seen something that looks kind of like this before, that slimy yuck that's on rocks and on the bottom of your lake or your river. Those can be algae too. And they're not just slimy yuck, they're important to everything that happens in the water, right? And some of the algae that live on rocks can actually be really interesting. So here's an example of an algae that can live on rocks. And it's interesting because, you know, we talked about the phytoplankton, they can't actually move very readily, but this one can control its movements a little bit. It has this slit that goes down the middle of it. It's called a raphe. And that actually secretes a little bit of mucus so that it can scoot along those rocks a little bit. And I wanted to show you, you know, I keep referring to algae as slimy yuck because that's how everyone thinks of them, but they're really not. And if you look at them under a microscope, they look a little bit more like this. It's kind of like looking through a kaleidoscope, and they're really beautiful. And they have a lot of really interesting adaptations and a lot of really interesting life history features. So you might recognize this one from when I referred to algae as the Arnold Schwarzeneggers of the lake. This is called Volvox. And this species of algae, all of these little, we have this main circle here, right? That's encasing all of these little circles. And what this algae is doing is it's reproducing. So there are all these little balls, and these are clones of itself, of the Volvox. And when it comes time to release those, the cell will basically explode open, and all of the clones will be released out into the ecosystem. We have other species of algae that are more colonial, and so they have specialized cells that do things like they help with reproduction, or they help with fixing nitrogen into a more usable form, or they help with feeding. So those are interesting algae. We have some that have little tails on them that help them control their movements. We have some that have this lattice structure in them that gives them their structure and helps them keep them firm and protected. And then, you know, we have obviously beautiful algae that look like this, like again, like you're looking through a kaleidoscope. And then I like to show these ones because they're really pretty green, but some algae just look like boring little peas. So next I want to talk about zooplankton. So we're moving up in the food chain a little bit. Zooplankton, in terms of what they eat, they're heterotrophic just like you and I. That means they have to eat other organisms to get their energy. They are not photosynthetic like the algae that we just talked about. And they can be herbivorous, meaning they eat algae, so they eat plants and algae in the lake or river, or they can be carnivorous, meaning they eat usually other zooplankton. And so already you can see the really pretty diversity that we have of zooplankton. In terms of where they live in the lake, usually you're going to find them pretty close to their food source. And so it really depends on what they're eating and where you're going to find them in the lake or in the river. And so you can find them in most open bodies of water that you think of, but you can also find them in bog lakes, which is pretty cool because bog lakes are very acidic. And you can even sometimes find them, I've heard, in vernal pools. So if you have an area that tends to be wet most of the time in the woods, usually in the woods in a shaded area that dries up sometimes sometimes you can find zooplankton in those areas as well. Their life cycle is really interesting for zooplankton, and it really depends on the species. Some zooplankton reproduce sexually and some reproduce asexually by cloning themselves. So I have a couple examples up here. And looking at this one right here, this copepod, this is an example of a zooplankton that reproduces sexually, meaning it lays eggs. And so you can see the adult here will lay eggs. So we have our little eggs here. And those eggs hatch into what are called nauplii. They look like little ticks or little spiders. And then they molt. So they'll shed their outer skin, they'll grow bigger, they'll shed their outer skin until they're eventually the size of a full-grown adult again, and they can start reproducing and laying eggs. We also have species of zooplankton that can reproduce asexually, meaning they don't need a partner. And a lot of, this is a Daphnia as an example, a type of cladoceran. And these guys don't necessarily need a mate in order to reproduce. They can clone themselves. And so all of these little dots in here are inside a female Daphnia, and these are all clones of herself. And so those will grow into little babies that I have a little video of the Daphnia birthing some babies. And they will be released out into the water, and they'll be left on their own to survive. An interesting thing about these Daphnia, though, is that, you know, while a lot of the population is female, they do tend to keep males, I like to say they keep them on hand for stressful situations when they have like an increase in predators or a change in environmental conditions. And at that point, they'll start producing what are called resting eggs. And this is a really sturdy pouch that they produce here. And each of these darker dots inside here, can you guys see those? Yeah. Each of those is an egg. So you have one egg, two egg, one egg, two egg, one egg, two egg. And those will be released down into the sediment, and they'll lie in wait there for, I learned this morning, they can lie in wait for hundreds of years. And they wait until those ecological conditions are more favorable to their growing conditions, and then they will hatch and do their zooplankton thing. So if you want to play that video there, Pat, and just make sure she's muted. And if you could start it at 1 minute and 40 seconds, that would be great. So something to mention here. So what we're looking at here is a zooplankton. She's upside down, so her eye is going to be on the bottom part of there. And what you'll notice about that is that it kind of looks like she's wearing a cloak. And that's because they have a carapace that goes over most of their body organs, and it opens in a slit in the front. And as the babies are all situated inside her, she has what's called a post-abdominal claw, and she'll use those to kick those species out. So you can see that in the video on a couple previous slides. Yep. That one. Oop. So on the bottom right there. Yep, and you can start 1 minute and 40 seconds. So again, she's upside down, and you can see all her little babies inside her. And in slow motion, those black dots are eyes. Look, oh. So she's just kicking them out. And I think that's so interesting. And then they're off to live on their own. So we can go to the next slide. So those are some interesting tidbits about zooplankton that I find especially fascinating. And just like with the algae, I wanted to show you some examples of how diverse and beautiful that these zooplankton can be. So these are the Daphnia that we just talked about, kicking their young out with that post-abdominal claw, and also cloning themselves. But they have this really interesting feature that they can do. It's called cyclomorphosis. And what happens is that over many generations, these zooplankton can actually change the shapes of their heads and their tail spines. So you can see over time, this plankton is getting a pointier head. It's getting longer and pointier. And that tail spine is also getting longer. And that's a response to predation. And so it makes them harder to eat. If they're larger, then those fish can't as easily fit them in their mouths. One of my favorite types of zooplankton right here, This Bosmina has a little snoot. I think this is really cute. It looks like an elephant. This one, Leptodora, is also really cool. It's hard to see, and that's exactly what it looks like. If you were to look at one of these under a microscope, they're really difficult to see. They're pretty much clear. And so Leptodora, what it'll do is use these, it's carnivorous, and it'll use these really long arms to basically capture zooplankton, and then it will bite into it and suck out its insides. Another really interesting species of zooplankton is called Halopedium. I like this one. I like its snoot on this one as well. And they just have these really beautiful colors that you can see when you look at them under a microscope. And they're pretty cool because they create this like kind of like a tapioca ball substance around themselves that they use for protection. And so sometimes when you see the large blooms of these, you can get them in your zooplankton net, and they look like you're holding a big handful of tapioca balls. Okay, and I have another video to show you of Daphnia swimming, just because I think it's kind of cool. You can get this one too, yeah. So these are our Daphnia swimming. They're also sometimes called water fleas, and that's because of the way they swim. It's kind of like that jerky motion, like a flea hopping around. I also think this video is really relaxing. So if you've had a stressful day so far, I think it's kind of fun to look at this and relax a little bit. So that's just an example of what they look like in a really concentrated way when they're all swimming around. And can you help me advance to the next slide there, Pat? So I've talked about zooplankton to a lot of different people, and I tend to, I've been told, give people nightmares when I talk about zooplankton because they look a little funny. And, you know, especially children, they're wondering, am I going to go and swim in this body of water and get bit by one of these things? The answer is no. You can't really look into a lake and see these things. Even if you collected a jar of water, just, you know, like willy-nilly collected it out of the water and looked at it, you wouldn't be able to see those zooplankton in there. You can really only see them if you collect them in a really concentrated amount. So you can see in these jars, they're very concentrated amounts of them, and they just look like white little specks. And they're collected with these kind of cone-shaped nets that you can see. And the size of your net just depends on the size of the area that you're sampling. So you can see this gal here is sampling in like a smaller pond, or she might even be in a ditch here. And then someone sampling out in the Great Lakes is using this big old net here. And they have this big opening on them, and they're shaped like a cone. And what they will do is let those sink down into the bottom, or however far down you want to sample, and bring them up. And all of the plankton are swept down into a cup at the bottom, and you can rinse that cup out into a jar, and that's what you're left with. So I know I spent a lot of time on zooplankton just because I love them so much, but the next creature we're going to talk about, we won't spend too much time on, but I think that they're also incredibly interesting. They're called tardigrades, also called water bears or moss piglets. And that's because, you know, they really do, if you look at them under, you know, electron microscopes or specialized microscopes, they really do look like little bears or pigs, except that they have 8 legs. And they're possibly the hardiest animals in existence. And so we hear people kind of joke around like there's a nuclear fallout or the end of the world, then cockroaches and canned cheese are the things that are going to survive. But actually, I think it's going to be the tardigrade or the water bear, because these things can survive. I have a whole list here. Temperatures ranging from -450 up to boiling. They can even survive being boiled in alcohol. They can survive 30 years frozen, which means 30 years without food. They've been brought to outer space so they can survive a vacuum environment with extreme radiation. And they can also survive pressures up to 6 times of the deepest part of the ocean, which is twice as much pressure as bacteria can handle. So I think after a while, scientists were just trying to figure out what could kill these things. The next animal I want to talk about is called the hydra. And hydra are named after the mythical creature Hydra. that are this kind of dragon-like creature here. And this is the creature where if you cut one head off, it regrows two more. And we're going to talk about why that's a pretty good name for the hydra in a second here. They're very simple, and they don't have organs and tissues like you and I do. You know, they don't have a digestive system or a respiratory system or anything like that. They just have specialized cells that help with digesting and feeding and reproduction and things like that. And they're very, very small. They're only about 0.2 to 0.6 inches long. And they're actually related to jellyfish and coral here. That's why I have a picture of the jellyfish and the coral. This here is what they actually look like. They have that long kind of tube feature with like tentacles coming off the top of them. And I always think about these things that you see at car dealerships that wave around and catch people's attention. And so if there's anything I hope you take away from this presentation, may you look at these and think of hydra now from the future. So they are carnivorous, and they tend to eat zooplankton or other little bugs or other little food particles that are floating around in the environment. And the way that they eat those things is actually pretty interesting. So what they'll do is they'll suction on to something, usually a harder substrate. So you can see this hydra is suctioned onto a plant. And they have that extension of their body, that tubular extension. And then we talked about they have these tentacles. And so those will kind of wave around in the water column. They can't move, so they're stuck there. So those tentacles are waving around. And whenever they feel a prey item, be it a zooplankton or another little piece of food, they'll use these specialized cells at the end of those tentacles that are called nematocysts. And they sting their prey and immobilize it and shove it into their body cavity. So here's an example of a cross section of a hydra, and you can see the inside of it right here. So they shove the prey in there. Here's a real life example of what that looks like. And then they have specialized enzymes that they release that will break down and digest and absorb the nutrients from that prey item. And then anything that they don't want to eat, they spit it back out through the same hole. So I kind of talked about where they live a little bit in terms of, you know, suctioning onto harder surfaces. And they tend to live in more shallow waters, and you'll see them again stuck onto plants like you can see here or here, stuck onto rocks. Sometimes I have never seen them stuck onto sand, but I also haven't looked that closely at sand to see that. But this picture is showing them on sand, so they must live on sand as well. Their life cycle is very interesting. They reproduce asexually, which again means that they don't need a mate. They can do it all on their own. And they reproduce by what's called budding, which basically means they're growing a clone of themselves off their side here. So you can see this is our original hydra right here. And then this is the bud that's coming off the side. And it'll get bigger and bigger until it's large enough to eventually be pinched off, and it will flourish into an adult happy hydra on its own. And in good conditions, they can produce 1 to 2 buds every few days. So that's a pretty good reproduction rate. The next set of hidden water creatures I want to talk about are macroinvertebrates. So looking at that word macroinvertebrates, if we break that down, macro meaning you can see it without a microscope, unlike our other water bear friends and zooplankton and algae that we talked about before. These are visible without a microscope. And invertebrate meaning they do not have a backbone. And so these are basically, I like to think of them as the bugs that live in the water. And a lot of these macroinvertebrates, things like dragonflies, mayflies, stoneflies, they're at what's called the nymph stage of their life cycle, which I like to think of as like the baby to teenage stage in their life cycle. And for a lot of these nymphs, that state of being a nymph, that nymphhood, is the bulk of its life cycle. So for a lot of animals like mayflies or dragonflies, that nymph stage can be up to 90% of its life that it's spending living in the water before it emerges on land. There are other examples of macroinvertebrates that aren't at their nymph stage, so things like leeches and snails. But for the most part, when we think about macroinvertebrates, we tend to think of, you know, the mayflies and the dragonflies. So one example of a macroinvertebrate is the dragonfly, like we talked about. And just kind of an interesting fun fact here on dragonflies is that they've been zooming around the world for about 300 million years. But those original dragonflies that were around that long ago didn't really look like the ones that we have on land today. They were actually had a wingspan of about 3 feet. And so if you look at this image right here, you can see how large a dragonfly would be compared to your average human, or this diagram here of this gal holding a ye old dragonfly, and you can see how large it would be compared to a human as well. So those smaller, more modern dragonflies evolved around the time of the dinosaurs, about 180 million years ago, but our original dragonflies were gigantic. So as with the other groups, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the diversity of the macroinvertebrates here. Just pointing out a couple of my favorites. I really like the dragonflies. If you ever have a chance to go to a dragonfly presentation, I would really recommend going to that. They have really interesting ways of feeding and flying. But my favorite is the scud. It looks like a little shrimp there. And then you can see the other ones, you know, like leeches are part of the macroinvertebrates. And the other ones really just look like bugs. But if you look at them again under a microscope, they all have their own ways of moving. They all have their own specialized colors. And they're really, really interesting to take a look at. Another interesting little tidbit about macroinvertebrates is they can be used to create what's called a biotic index. And a biotic index is, we have the definition right here, a scale that shows the quality of an environment based on the types of organisms present. And the way that works is that different macroinvertebrates have different tolerance levels to different levels of pollution. Does that make sense the way I said that? Okay, so we have several levels of pollution tolerance here. I hope you can read these, but if not, I'm going to read them to you. So we have a set of macroinvertebrates that is depicted down here at the bottom of the screen. And these macroinvertebrates can tolerate pollution and survive in poor water quality. So they can survive in a wide range of water quality conditions, including poor water quality. And then you have the group in the middle here that can also survive in a wide range of water quality conditions, but they need the water to be a little bit cleaner. So they can't survive in super dirty water. And then you have organisms at the top here who need really, really, really good water quality to survive. Think about these really high quality trout streams that we have. That's where you're going to find the most diverse aquatic macroinvertebrates, because in those good water quality conditions, you can find any of these macroinvertebrates, whereas in poor water quality conditions, you're likely to only find these bottom ones. Does that make sense the way I described that? Okay. So moving on, the next group I want to talk about are freshwater mussels. And they're not hidden in the sense that they're really small, but I think they're hidden in the sense that we just tend to not think of them very often. You know, we tend to see like piles of mussel shells on the side of rivers and lakes. And, you know, we're just like, oh, an animal must have been there eating and feasting on those mussels. And then you don't really think about it anymore. But also, if you look at this picture down here, you can see they're hidden in the sense that they're really well camouflaged. And North America is a great place to live because we have one of the highest diversities of freshwater mussels in the world. And actually in Wisconsin, we also have a very high diversity of freshwater mussels, but over half of them are threatened. And that's because mussels are filter feeders. And because they're filter feeders, they're very sensitive to declines in water quality. So they're constantly sucking water in and pushing water out. And because of that, you know, they don't really have much of a filter to filter out any sort of pollution or anything like that. And so they are also natural filters and purifiers as well. So when they're sucking that water in and pushing it out, they're mostly eating algae. And the way that they do that is that they have these little holes in the side of them. If you're lucky enough to be snorkeling and come upon one of these while it's eating, I recommend you kind of hover over that for a little bit and watch this process because it's really interesting. And so they have these little holes that they'll open up, and they have actually 2 of them. If you're able to see them, they have an intake and an output. And so one of these holes is constantly sucking water in, and then inside we're filtering all of that water and taking out all the yum-yums that we want to eat. And then anything that we don't want, all that extra water and anything we don't want to eat, we're pushing back out through this other hole. And one mussel, depending on the species, can filter 13 to 80 gallons of water a day. So they're actually filtering quite a bit of water. And there are really interesting pictures out there of mussels in fish tanks, and they show them the fish tank is really cloudy. And then after an hour of having the mussels in it, they show the fish tank and it's perfectly clear. So it can be kind of interesting to watch videos like that. Because mussels, they can't really move very well. They have a foot on them that they use to bury themselves into the sediment, and they can kind of scoot around on the sediment a little bit. But for the most part, they can't really move. And so a lot of mussels will prefer flowing water because they can't move to food sources, right? They always want that kind of new influx of food coming into them. So a lot of them prefer flowing water in a river or a stream, but you'll find some in lakes too. And they just burrow into the bottom of the floor, and they look just like this. Well, they'll just sit and filter away. And like I said earlier, they do require a nice clean water. And so if you're looking for some good mussel habitat, I have a little diagram here that hopefully you can see. So we have good mussel habitat on the right and bad mussel habitat on the left. So the good mussel habitat, you can see we have nice stable shorelines, natural shorelines, trees and plants, nice clean water. That gives you a happy, healthy mussel population. Whereas if you have a lot of impervious surfaces, maybe litter, dams, increased sedimentation issues, then that's not really very good mussel habitat because again, they're filtering everything out. The life cycle of a freshwater mussel is mind-blowing, and we're going to go over it here today. So mussels will reproduce sexually, meaning there are males and female mussels. And so following here, so we're going to start at 1 and go all the way around here. So starting at number 1, we have our male and female mussels. The male will release sperm out into the water, and that is basically sucked in by the female, and she'll use that to fertilize her eggs. And once those eggs have grown, not into adulthood, but they've hatched and they've grown a little bit, they're called glaucidia, and that's what we're seeing right here. These are enlarged. They're actually really tiny. I'll show you what they look like for reference size. But these glaucidia that the female releases out into the water are parasitic, which means they need another host to complete their life cycle. They're not just going to be released and be able to be on their own right away. Those glaucidia, they look like little Pac-Men, are going to attach themselves to the gill filaments of a host fish. So under the neck of a fish, you see those gills, and those glaucidia are vampires. They're going to be sucking onto those gills and gaining all the nutrients that are coming to that fish. They're not hurting the fish. I know that sounds painful and bad for it, but the fish is okay in that process. And once they're large enough, those glaucidia, they grow while they're attached to that host filament. They will fall off and they will become juvenile mussels that, just sit in the sediment and filter water just like the adults. So they'll grow into adulthood in that way. This process of attaching to a host fish is also important because it helps disperse the mussels too. So remember we talked about mussels can't really move that well. Well, once they're attached to a fish, they're going to go wherever the fish is going. And so that helps to disperse the mussels as well. So that process of attaching to a fish's gills, it's not as straightforward as you might think. The female is not just pumping glaucidia out into the water willy-nilly. She's actually doing it very carefully. And the way she's doing it is by impersonating a prey fish that host fish is going to want to eat. So you can see we have a picture of a mussel. Here's the mussel down here. And then here's another picture of a mussel down here. And they have these appendages that they'll stick out and wave around into the water that look like fish. They look like prey fish. And so the big fish is going to come along thinking that this is a nice tasty snack. And what will happen is that when the fish gets close enough and tries to eat this, the female will bring that back inside of herself and force all of the glaucidia into the mouth of the fish. Some species of mussel depend on very specific species of fish, which can actually be problematic because if those fish die off, that mussel no longer has a host for it to live on. And there's a video of it. If you just Google mussels mating, which is a totally normal thing to Google, you can find pictures or videos of mussels doing this, and it's really fascinating. And there's just a little bit of their diversity. So I have a couple more animals to talk about here today. I know I only have about 5 minutes left, so we'll go a little bit quickly over these. The next one I want to talk about are bryozoans, and these things look like big blobby brains. So you may have seen these in lakes and rivers before. There are over 400 million years old, so there is fossil evidence records of them being that old, and there's currently about 5,000 species. Most of them are marine species, but we do have about 20 freshwater species in North America. And these are invertebrate colonies, meaning different parts of these are used for like hatcheries and reproduction and defense and things like that. And when you look at them, since they are colonies, there's a whole bunch of individuals. So this is our big blobby brain town. And then we have individuals that are coming out of that. So they look like brooms here. And they're coming out and they're secreting mucus around themselves to attach themselves to each other and to make that big blobby brain town. And I have a video of them filtering. We're not going to show it just because I'm running short on time, but you can see from the video those what those appendages look like sticking out, and the ends of those brooms will kind of twitter around and seek out food particles for them to eat. And here are, you can see it even better. These are marine sponges, but they look they look pretty similar to freshwater sponges. So you can see them coming out of their little mucus homes and what they look like there. The last species I want to talk about, or the last type of animals I want to talk about, are freshwater sponges. And they are very similar to an ocean sponge, except they look a little bit more like this. And they are like the pool filters of the water. And so they are constantly sucking water in and pushing it out. And you can kind of see that. Disregard all the scientific mumbo jumbo on this image here. But what I really want you to look at are these blue arrows here. And you can see that the water motion is coming into the cell and being pumped out of it. And that I do want to show you a video of. Pat, if you could help me on the next slide. And started at 1 minute and 45 seconds in.
Pumping.
And you can mute it too if you want.
With no mouth, it sucks water directly.
So this is a marine sponge, and what we're showing here is that dye is being placed at the base of the sponge, and then it's being forced out through the top of it. So it really does look like a pool filter in that way. Just a little bit of sponge diversity, including SpongeBob SquarePants. Sponges, not a lot about them is known, actually. Even if you do Google images of freshwater sponges, you don't find a lot of information. And so I took these pictures. You can see sponges can be kind of branchy, or they can just look like kind of like an algae growing on a dead log or a dead branch. They have a really interesting smell. If you find a freshwater sponge, give it a sniff. And I wanted to show this picture. This was the best day of my life. This is when I found a sponge growing next to a bryozoan on the same stick. And so in conclusion, it'd be awesome if you remember that, volvox will explode when they reproduce, or that macroinvertebrates are mostly in their nymph stage, or that zooplankton can reproduce sexually and asexually. All those things are great things to remember. But at the end of the day, what I would like you to take away from this is that a lake or any body of water, a bog, a river, a stream, when you look at it, there's more to it than meets the eye. And so hopefully next time you're looking at your system, you can look at it and imagine something more like this. And I like this quote by Jack Longino. It says, if you're shopping for a home entertainment system, you can't do better than a good dissecting microscope. And with that, if you have any questions, I don't think we have time here to take any questions, but I put my email address here. You're always welcome to email me any questions that you have, or if you find anything cool in the water, send me a picture of it because I like seeing that stuff. Thank you. Did we have time for questions or? Okay. Yeah, Zach. That's a really good question that I don't know the answer to, but I'm going to look it up now that you've asked that.